Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Solar Power Europe webinar, Realizing the Solar Potential in Europe on the Ground, which will discuss how we establish in Europe swift and efficient administrative procedures to realize the renewable energy ambition. If I go to the next slide, I can give you a view of what's the program for the hour and a half that we have. I will start by setting the scene, reminding you some market figures. I will do that. I'm Senior Policy Advisor at Solar Power Europe. Then we will present to you the results of the RES Simplify project, a project to which Solar Power Europe is participating together with Eclareon and Öko Institute, as well as Wind Europe. So we'll have Yoga Talat Kelp-Saite, Senior Project Manager at Eclareon, and Dominique Siba, Senior Researcher at Öko Institute, presenting us the results. And then we will move to a discussion with distinguished panelists from the Commission and from the solar industry, but also with you to discuss the results of the study. And then we'll be extremely pleased to have Jutta Paulus, a member of the European Parliament, sharing some closing words to this discussion. As mentioned, the discussion is also a discussion that we want to have with you, the attendees of this webinar. So if you have any questions on the presentations or a comment to what is being discussed, you can share them during the webinar through the GoToWebinar software. You should see a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen with a question box. You can type your question there, and we'll take it up in the discussion. And before moving to our panel, I would like to start by just some market figures to set a bit the scene in which we are for the solar industry. These figures come from our European Market Outlook, our flagship report, which we publish every year. The last European Market Outlook was shared in December last year and is available on our website. What does it say? The first element is that 2021 was a record year for the solar market. We had 25.9 gigawatts installed in the EU, which represents a 34% growth of the annual market compared to 2020, a year during which we installed 19.3 gigawatts. And it's really a record year because it's historically the year in which we installed the most solar PV in Europe, after the other record year that was in 2011. And as you can see on the graph, this is really part of a new growth phase that has started since 2018. And this phase is not going to stop, but is going to continue. During the upcoming 4 years and until 2025, which is the limit for our analysis, the market will continue growing with a double-digit growth of the annual market every year. So we're really talking about an exponential growth. And we should reach, according to our medium scenario, an annual additional capacities of 49.7 gigawatts in 2025. So almost 50 gigawatts. If now we talk about cumulative capacity, it means that we will probably pass the 300 gigawatt mark of solar capacity installed in the EU by 2025, compared to an installed capacity as of today of 164.9 gigawatts. If we now have a look at where this capacity is installed, we really see a trend of diversification. The graph that you see on the screen shows you the gigawatt market. So the gigawatt size markets, the markets in which we had 1 gigawatt or more of solar PV installed. In 2020, we had 5 gigawatt size market. In 2021, we have 7 gigawatt markets with as consistent leaders, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, with the Netherlands being the country where we have the most gigawatt installed per capita. And if we look at the trend towards 2025, the growth and the diversification should continue with 12 gigawatt market in the EU. So really more and more countries seeing the growth of solar in at national level and having, of course, to adapt all of their permitting processes. This is, of course, the market forecast, but in our 2050 study, we also looked at the potential, and we see that the potential is even more diverse in the EU. If we look at now at the 2030 target, as now the EU is discussing about its revised renewable energy target, we see that we can do actually even more. The European Commission has at the moment proposed a new renewable energy target of 40% of renewable energy in the EU by 2030, which would represent 479 gigawatts of solar PV installed. When we look at our market forecast, and if we take a business as usual scenario, we anticipate that we will overshoot this target with 672 gigawatts installed already. So our message is really that we can do more. And we think that we have a potential to do 870 gigawatts of solar PV installed in 2030 to be consistent with 1.5 degree Paris scenario, which would translate into a renewable energy target of 45%. But of course, these are objectives, and we need to realize objectives on the ground, and that's where this webinar wants to provide answers. To do that, we will start with the presentation of the result of the RES Simplify project. I'm very happy to have Yorga and Dominic with me to present the topic, and I'll now give the floor to Yorga Talat-Kelpsaite to present the first part of the results. Yorga, over to you.
So, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. Yes, okay, great. So I'm very happy that we have so many participants today to hear about our study results, results of the Resimplify project. My name is Yorga Talat-Kelpsaite, like Naomi already introduced me, and I'm Senior Project Manager at Clarion and leading the project, Resimplify project, and working together on this project with Öko-Institute and Solar Power Europe and Wind Europe. And now I will start. I hope it's working over here. Switching the slides. Not yet. Let's wait for a minute. Maybe Dominic, you can also introduce yourself briefly before we start with the presentation, and I'll wait for slides to be able to be moved.
Thank you, Jürgen. Yes, my name is Dominic Seebach, working at Öko-Institute in Freiburg, Germany, and we are a project partner here in Resimplify, particularly focusing on questions on what are good examples in order to improve permission procedures for renewables around Europe. And I will be happy to present some of those examples in order to trigger also your feedback and stimulate you to share your experience in that field on how to overcome existing barriers and improve the permission procedures in Europe. But Jürgen, I think now you have everything under control, right?
I think it works. Yes, I hope so. So yes, again, I would like to present together with Dominic our Simplify results on the administrative the barriers in the administrative and grid connection procedures in the EU member states, and also identify best practices across European countries. So while
Jurga, I can't hear you, and it looks as if you're still muted.
Okay.
Okay, better.
Now? It's strange. Now you can hear me again?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, so I repeat again, sorry for that. So I will start the presentation with the short introduction into our project, the Simplify project. And then I will give you a qualitative assessment or overview of a qualitative assessment of administrative and grid connection procedures in the EU countries. In the next step, I will give you an overview of the key administrative and grid connection barriers that we came across during our research. And then Dominic will present best practices that have been identified in the Simplify project for renewable installations in administrative and grid connection procedures. And then we'll give you some concluding remarks, and we finalize the presentation with a Q&A session. So to achieve ambitious EU targets, member states have also set their national targets for the year 2030 in the electricity sector. And you can see from the map on the left side of the slide and the graph on the right side of the slide that the great majority of the countries for the achievement of their electricity targets, renewable energy targets in the electricity sector for 2030 count mainly on wind and solar power. But it doesn't change. It takes really long to switch the slide, sorry. But if we look at the figures of the years 2009 till 2019, I don't have the figures like Naomi showed for 2020 and 2021. But you can see that the development of solar power in the EU member states was pretty inconsistent in this time. And especially if you look at the years 2014 and until 2017 and still 2018, there was little solar power developed in the EU member states compared to the years 2010, 11, and 12. And yeah, so if you look also, it says the same what Naomi already showed, that if you look at the countries, the EU member states, you see that solar power development is also inconsistently in the EU member states. So even 85% of solar power is being developed in only 6 markets. Now we saw in 2021, it's already 7 markets. And the markets being Germany, Italy, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And so you can see that there is still a huge potential for additional growth in many markets. And I'm happy that Naomi showed that the forecasts are pretty much promising for the upcoming years. Nevertheless, if we look at the results for another project for the European Commission, RNP, in this project, we drafted a reveal database covering different barriers, not only administrative and grid connection barriers, but also financial, technological, political, legal, and all kinds of barriers to renewable energies development in the EU member states. So the results of a reveal database show that administrative and grid connection related issues in the EU member states account for 46% of all barriers identified. And with the ongoing trends of business models that are less and less dependent on the support schemes, like, for example, PPAs or zero-bid tenders for wind, mainly. So the importance of these non-financial barriers, including administrative barriers, is expected even to increase in the next future. In this context, the DG launched this very important project, Simplify, and the mission of our project is to improve administrative and grid connection procedures for renewable energy installations in the EU member states. And the improvement is being achieved through the research, or is aimed to be achieved through the research, analysis, and benchmarking of status quo in the EU member states with regard to the barriers in the administrative procedures and also good practices, identification of best practices and drafting policy recommendations to the European Commission at the end of the project, and also dissemination and communication of project results, which is being done through a huge variety of events and bilateral and multilateral meetings, workshops, webinars. And one of these dissemination activities or events is also today's webinar with you. Where we are with our project, so we already mapped administrative and grid connection processes in the EU member states, 27 EU member states, Iceland and Norway, and produced 29 comprehensive country reports describing process step and steps for selected renewable energy technologies per country, and also administrative and grid connection related barriers and good practices. Identified approximately 400 administrative and grid connection related barriers in the EU member states, and more than 50 good practices. And so we are happy to discuss these good practices also today with you to even increase the number of good practices to be shared among member states in the end within this project. So here is the table briefly showing the technologies for which per country we mapped the administrative and grid connection procedures and tried to identify the barriers and best practices. The focus during our mapping task was on the precise sector because we saw that the member states are mainly focusing on wind and solar power in the achievement of their renewable energy targets, and put a stronger focus on precise compared to, for example, a heating sector, unfortunately. So let's move to the qualitative assessment of administrative and grid related procedures. Before I show the results, when we started with the mapping task on the administrative processes, we identified several process steps which are relevant when implementing renewable energy projects. You see them on the right side of the slide, but this is only generalized description of the process, implementation process, and it doesn't mean that all the steps are implemented in a chronological order in all member states. For example, in Spain, the process implementation process is being started with a grid connection instead of site selection, although in most of the countries it starts with the site selection. So the idea was of having these process steps and identifying barriers per process steps was mainly to be able to compare the results in the member states and not having a comprehensive guidelines to the project developers or other stakeholders when looking at the implementation of the projects in the member states. So here you see the results on the identified barriers for process steps in the member states for the ground-mounted PV installations. So you can see that administrative authorization process step and grid connection permitting process step are the process steps which are most hindered by the barriers in the member states, even moderate barriers, as has been reported by the stakeholders that we interviewed for this project. In Slovakia, you see that the grid connection permitting process step is hindered severely by the barriers, and this is this is mainly due to the moratorium which is in place since 2014 in this country, and which precludes connection of new installations greater than 10 kilowatts to the electricity grid. You can see also that site selection, for example, and electricity production process steps are less hindered by and negatively affected by the barriers in the member states. Also, for example, you see that site selection in Belgium is affected by severe barriers, and this is mainly due to the competing land uses, because the country is very populated, densely populated. So now I will give you an overview of the key administrative and grid connection barriers. This is a very short overview. Of course, we have a very long report on the barriers, which will be published most probably in summer, where I may give there maybe more information, and then you can read a little bit in more detail, of course, about the barriers identified in the member states, because of the short time today, it's not possible to go through them in more detail. So how we dealt with the barriers. So we identified the barriers during the desktop research and the interviews with the stakeholders in the EU member states. And then in order to identify some cross-country patterns, we grouped these barriers in certain predefined categories, which you see in blue in this slide. The categories included conflicting public goods, process-related issues, third-party issues, and grid issues. And all of these 4 categories had also predefined subcategories. So we put all the identified barriers in these subcategories in order to see which countries have similar problems with regard to the implementation of renewable energy projects. So what we see, if we look at the situation in the member states, we see that in all member states, mainly or in the great majority of the member states, process-related issues account for more than or at least 50% of barriers identified. So conflicting public goods, for example, category is very relevant in Belgium and also in Malta and Greece, while third-party issues negatively, or there are a lot of barriers belonging to this category, third-party issues category, in Denmark and also in Slovenia. So what are the consequences of the barriers identified? So first of all, of course, delays of projects, which is most common consequence, as you can see from this slide, but also increased complexity is very common consequence, and feasibility and cost, although less common, but still often a problem in the EU member states. So what are the prevailing barrier categories for ground-mounted PV in the EU member states? So first of all, bureaucratic issues, and we will talk about it in our panel discussion later, including, for example, repeating requests from the competent authorities for additional documents, which has been reported as very common barrier in many member states. So bureaucratic issues is one of the key barriers and prevalent in almost all member states. As you can see, you can look at the icon with the documents on the map on the right side of this slide. Also, issues related to environment are widespread. It is demonstrated by the leaf icon on the map. Has been identified in many countries, like, for example, Denmark, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and many more countries. Land use conflicts is also a very dominant barrier in the member states, but also insufficient spatial planning is strongly affecting implementation of ground-mounted PV projects in the member states. We also looked at another type of barrier called lack of features to these administrative processes. So some of these elements are already included in RED 2. But what our results disclosed is that single administrative procedures are widespread, but often only for certain technologies or certain capacities of the technologies. The pre-planning is still little used in the European countries, mainly for wind. If it's used, it's mainly used for wind. Then project acceptance measures become more and more popular. We identified several of them, especially in Denmark and some other countries, but they are also mainly relating to wind power projects so far. And also streamlining of litigation has been detected so far in 4 markets during our research, at least what has been communicated by the stakeholders and could be identified during the research, desktop research in our projects. So I think that's all for the time being from my part, and I would give the word to Dominic, who will present some best practices we came across during our research for renewable installations in the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jurga. So now it's an honor for me to present some of the project findings which we have developed within the Resimplify project, where it was particularly within the tasks of me and my colleagues at Öko-Institut to have a focus coming from barriers to solutions. And as I already had said before, I will now present some ideas on what is already happening within the European member states, which has been highlighted by stakeholders or national experts as good practice, and hopefully can be used as an example on what can be done also in other member states. I'm still waiting for the slide to move further. Okay, now. So what have we done within this project? So we had, based on work done by national experts at Eclarion, an initial input on the best practice examples which have been identified in the country analysis, including desktop research, interviews with stakeholders, and also have analyzed different type of literature, publications, statements on what has been proposed also by different stakeholders or research projects around Europe on how to improve permission procedures. And based on that, we went into in-depth discussions with experts and stakeholders, focusing on individual technologies in order to see how different aspects are seen by these stakeholders in their national context, but also on a European level, in order to identify best practice solutions, and also based on that, policy recommendations. We have classified what we have found in that respect in different, well, dimensions or fields of action, which need to be addressed or can be addressed in order to improve permission procedures. These includes now, from left to right, shown on this slide, that the administrative communication and monitoring processes can be improved. There should be sufficient guidance and best practice examples in order to improve expertise and level of knowledge around all parties that are involved in permission procedures, from project planners to other affected stakeholders, and last not least, the involved authorities. We found that permission procedures can be improved considerably by improving central provision of information, which just is quite efficient compared to an alternative approach where every single authority and every single project planner has a high effort in order to gather relevant information individually. In Germany and also other countries, acceptance is a very hot topic around developing new renewable projects. So participation and acceptance measures should be taken into account and should also be developed at a quite early stage in order to increase the probability to get RES permission, and finally also bring renewable capacity into operation. for at least some renewable projects, it seems relevant to have ease procedures. To that extent, this also covers small installations, which also for the field of PV is highly relevant, but also for repowering of existing plant, which is then more in the wind sector, a highly relevant aspect. And on a political side, it is also important or considered helpful to have clarified priority for renewables, which can be practically done in different ways, but in the end then trickle down to the permitting authorities and also to courts once it comes to a court case, in order to just have a clear statement and a clear situation that the development of renewable is of high priority for the society as such, and also compared to other goods, which of course have to be considered when discussing a permission of a new renewable project. And last not least, we also have developed some technology-specific recommendations besides these dimensions, once we found that those have been considered relevant. I'm now going to show some slides on individual best practice examples, which have been identified in the mentioned fields of action. And I hope that this is useful in order to give you an overview about what is already be done, what could be done also in other member states, and in the end also then trigger the discussion for the panel and also stimulate your feedback on additional hints and remarks on where can we really learn something from existing good practice examples also in other countries. So here on the top right, these are now examples focusing on administrative communication and processes. Here an example from Germany, but this is also done in some other countries, that e-communication is introduced for all or a major part of the whole application and permission procedure and the communication between the involved parties. Here in Germany, on the level of federal states, there has been brought an electronic authorization application platform into operation, which was found so successful that is now used in already 8 of the German federal states. On the one hand, this can lead to accelerated processes, but of course, electronic communication can also be easily filed. Therefore, it increases transparency. It leads to robust documentation, and it can also support monitoring on how the whole permission procedure goes in order to identify which process steps are problematic and should be tackled by any solution. In Denmark, administrative process, here you have an example for a one-stop shop, which is also required by European regulation. In the end, that means you have to have one face to the customer from the public side, so that also the whole procedure can be simplified, that competences are bundled. And in Denmark, the Danish Energy Agency serves as a one-stop shop for offshore applications. So this is an example from the wind offshore sector. And the DEA in the end then is more or less like a spider in the grid in order to manage the whole application procedure and takes over the responsibility for discussing all relevant aspects also with other authorities involved. There are also other examples that this can be done otherwise, that such a one-stop shop is really the central authority which also has the central competences for all relevant aspects. This can be done also on a national level, like here in Denmark, but in theory, it could also be done as a one-stop shop for different regions or federal states. It could be technology specific. In the end, the major benefit results from the fact that it's clear for all involved parties, particularly for project planners and developers, whom to talk to, and that for a given site and a given technology and a given project planner, it's clear that he's talking to one authority and the competences are bundled at that step. It has also been considered highly relevant that expertise for all involved parties is on a sufficient level, and therefore guidance and best practice examples are considered a really good approach. For example, in Italy, there has been project development guidance developed by regional competent authorities in the Lombardy region, which helps project developers with the application process and guides him through the whole procedure. A similar approach has been implemented in Spain, here on the bottom of this slide, where also different, here with a more focus on wind, such guidance material has been elaborated in order to guide all applicants through the process of applications. In Portugal, the approach includes a task force that assesses barriers in permitting and licensing, EIA, grid connections, so the whole permission procedure, which is also considered really a key element as such a institutionalized organization, here a task force, or it could be any other board or stakeholder platform, which is established to see what's really working well, what's going not so well, what are the specific barriers, and to develop with all the competences involved, then also ideas and approaches on how to overcome the country-specific and technology-specific problems that may pop up. And this can also be supported, which has been highlighted also in some countries, also by the electronic communication, because together with the electronic communication monitoring of the individual projects and also monitoring of the whole of the overall picture of all application processes is facilitated, so that it's easier to identify where are really systematically problems in the permission procedure and where do we need to get better. For project planners, it is often quite difficult in order to find suitable sites where they can focus their project development activities on. So in order to increase this efficiency, it has been highlighted that central data availability, and particularly the central provision of available sites in the format of GIS maps, is considered highly helpful. So there are some examples around Europe. So these are two examples from Spain and from Germany. In Spain, there's a database for spatial planning, which includes information on areas for renewable projects and land use restrictions. It covers aspects like restrictions by nature protection, conservation, safety of historical monuments. And this is quite helpful for project planners to identify where are suitable sites. And this then in this aspect, in that regard, is easy and efficient for project planners, but it also probably is quite a relief for involved authorities, as they only have to deal with project planners who are on a higher level of expertise and who are not making too much inquiries about sites which are out of scope anyway. In Germany, there's such an example with a focus on offshore wind, where critical sites due to environmental value are identified and transparently shown. So this then is helpful for offshore planners in order to make first site identification steps. In Germany and probably also in other countries, it's been quite a problem for the permission of renewables to gain the relevant and needed public acceptance and to avoid also court cases. And for that regard, it's important to talk to all parties involved and take their concerns into account, and also not be the only one to benefit from the renewables, but also make sure that the effects which result from renewables are for the local residents and municipalities and the directly affected neighbors, not only the more or less negative implications, but all the potential positive benefits, particularly by financial participation. So in Denmark, there is a mechanism in place that citizens and municipalities benefit financially directly from renewables projects, so that project planners pay the neighbors on an annual basis, and they contribute to affected municipalities to a green fund scheme in the sector of onshore wind. But that can also be applied, of course, for the case of PV, if that is considered relevant or there are some concerns from neighbors, that they can also benefit on a financial level. In Luxembourg, such an incentive is not only given from the planners to the municipalities, but directly from the state. So as municipalities have an important role in the whole permission procedure also, and the identification of suitable sites for the development and deployment of renewable electricity, Luxembourg is motivating the municipalities to be quite active in that respect by assigning subsidies to municipalities who have a high share of renewable energy projects on their territory. And that, of course, also then contributes to an increased acceptability on the local level and an increased availability of sites for the project planners.
Maybe, Dominic, just maybe a heads up to wrap it up so that we have time for the many questions that already arrived in the chat.
Okay, so I'll more or less focus on the headlines. So within the field of participation and acceptance, it's not only the financial aspect, but it's also you have to talk to the people, you have to take their concerns into account, and that is on an early stage already done also in some countries. In the Netherlands, for example, it's being done on a general level by having a code of conduct between different stakeholder organizations, including environmental NGOs and the Dutch sector organization Holland Solar. So that if everyone sticks to what has been discussed on a general level, then also the acceptance on the local level should be increased. There are quite some examples for ease procedures for repowering and small-scale RES. So here, for example, self-supplying communities, which might be particularly relevant for PV also. In Slovenia, that removes administrative barriers for the case that self-supply is in the focus of the renewable project, and in order also to give some support for such approaches and to take into account that here the level of professionalization probably is not as high as when we're talking about big renewable industry. The clarified priority for us, that's my last slide. I can give an example from Germany, where renewables are defined as a matter of public interest, which is considered particularly relevant when it comes to court, and of course in any permission procedure different aspects and interests have to be balanced and weighted. Species conservation, landscape conservation, but also the contribution of renewables in fighting climate change. And of course one can always argue, but is it really needed that this plant is built on this site? It's probably not for the individual case, but a lot of plants have to be built on a lot of sites, and therefore the priority should be clear, and such also a clear political and legal backing can be helpful in that respect. So I'll now move forward to conclusions, but still I think this is a slide, Jurga, which you can present. You're still muted.
Now it works. Yeah, I would skip the most have been said because we are more interested now, of course, in your contributions and discussions, the panel discussion, and also all the participants. And therefore, just to wrap it very quickly up, you see that there are some ambitious targets in new member states, but there is still much room for improvement with regard to administrative procedures. And therefore, it's important to do more, and the importance of our projects is even greater in this regard. And we are very happy to contribute to it. And yeah, so I think that we are very interested now to hear from you about further possibilities to improve permitting procedures for ground-mounted PV installations that can be taken by other member states. And yeah. I think I will stop here to give the floor to other speakers.
Thank you, Jurga and Dominique. Indeed, there are a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe we can then move to the next slide and present a bit our panelists, and I'll give to you the questions. Okay, so to continue the discussion, we have four panelists. Vera Kissler, your policy officer in the DGNR of the Commission and in charge of following this project and following the communication on permitting that will be published by the summer. Andrea Panizzo, your head of business development at Enel Green Power. Do not hesitate to turn on your camera so that everyone can see you. Then we are happy to have Faustine Guémard, your public affairs managers at Aku Energy, a French developer, and Daniel Hulder, your head of policies and markets at BayWa. The first question actually would go to our presenters, so Dominique and Jurga. Two questions really on the presentations. Why is Sweden not included in the solar PV assessment, and why France is not included in the analysis of the lack of features to ease administrative processes?
So I think it is referred to the first map with the national targets for renewable energy sources in electricity sector. So this is mainly because Sweden calculates their targets completely different, and we couldn't produce the same pie diagram, unfortunately, as for other countries. And they, yeah, this is mainly because of that. But we, of course, had Sweden in our mapping task. We mapped all the procedures and barriers and also good practices, the same as also in other countries. The second question, Francis also regarded in this case, as other countries, we map the procedures and barriers and best practices in all countries, as I said, 27 EU member states, Iceland and Norway. And maybe it's not on the map, I have to check, but yeah, thank you for this remark. But this is also being considered in our study.
Thank you for this clarification. In any case, you will have access to the slide of this webinar. So now maybe on the assessment and what has been presented, I would like to have the reaction of the project developers. Can you, comment a bit what was presented on what's happening today on the ground, and also because this project has focused on rooftop PV and ground-mounted PV, but we have increasingly projects with battery storage, and we also have agri-PV and floating PV projects. This was also a question in the chat. So can you also explain whether there are particular permitting procedures for this kind of projects? Maybe we can start with you, Andrea, to comment, and then Faustine.
Yes, thanks for the invitation, first of all, and good morning, everybody. Well, there are many comments can be made on the presentation that we just saw from Dominic and Jurga. Very interesting work, and I think this RES-Simplify project will help the governments to at least to solve partially or to accelerate the rate of permitting of renewables in Europe, both solar and wind, because the project is involving many technologies, not just the solar PV. By the point of view of an investor, as a utility, as Energy Power is, permitting is the main bottleneck today. And timing of permitting, of course, is the real issue that is not respected anywhere in Europe. So while for new project there should be 2 years of time, for repowering 1 year, we experience even 7-8 years in some countries, in some technologies. So timing of permitting is of essence. And this work should go in this direction to try to accelerate sharing the best practices. As you were mentioning, Naomi, there is a lack of many things. So for instance, new technologies such as storage or agri-PV are not regulated. So there is a lack of laws in understanding what to do, essentially, in order to promote these technologies in a specific country or in specific region inside the country. Because another issue is that inside the same country, there is not uniformity about the legislation and rules to follow. So this is the first pain point. Digitalization is missing almost everywhere. So most of the time we have to produce paper copies and heavy weights to authorities in order to start the permitting. So we are very far to be digitalized in many different aspects of the permitting path. So I will stop here for the moment. I would like to also hear the other colleagues, the point of view. Then I will add some other points on this presentation.
Thank you. But thank you indeed. I think it was a good first map. Faustine, maybe you want to complement, especially on agri-PV.
Yes, thank you. And thank you again, Dominic, for this very interesting work and presentation. I think it will be really useful for all of us. To add what Andrea said, indeed, we do face all these problems. And also with floating solar and agri-PV, we face the fact that we have an administration that doesn't know those technologies. And so they are very, very picky in finding whatever problems can happen. So we face an administration that is rather problem-oriented than solution-oriented, because, of course, for these problematics, we do have solutions. So there's really a need to find a global framework that could be national or European to avoid a case-by-case situation that is really, really dependent on the goodwill of the person we face. So I think that's really one of the main issues, and one solution for that could be also for the EU to finance capacity for public authorities, meaning to finance jobs, to have experts within local authorities, because that's what they lack, and that's also why they are so, I would say, reluctant to mainstream those kind of projects.
I think this is a good and concrete proposal that we could rediscuss. But maybe before turning to you, Daniel, again on this assessment, if you'd like to add anything on the problems you face. I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. So first of all, thank you for Jorga and Dominic for the good work, and the DGN for financing that. So it is very interesting. So of course, bureaucracy is all over Europe a major issue in permitting and in those processes. But if I look on Europe from a broader view, so the more south I go in Europe, the more the grid access is the bottleneck for the projects, and the more I go north, the land access is a main problem. So in northern Germany, if I have a site, I will get the project. In the southern Europe, I would say if I have the grid access, I get the project. So that's a general difference in Europe, but that's more or less all over Europe. And public acceptance is an increasing issue for solar now. So it is a big issue for wind projects, wind onshore since a long time, but it's an increasing issue for solar plants, for solar parks as well. And if it comes to the newer technologies, so as Andrea mentioned, we have lack of regulations for that. So we have to adapt the regulation to the new situation. For example, if it comes to agri-PV, yeah, if I get the how's it called in English, the space planning, the settlement zones planning for the agri-PV plants, that area is recognized as settlement area and not anymore as agricultural area, and that brings a lot of problems. So that was an example from Germany, because we never had in view that we would have an agri-PV plant, which is energy production and agriculture on the same area. So we simply don't have legislation for that. But that's a problem for the new technologies. But the main problems for the main business, for the solar parks and for the wind parks, are administrative problems, bureaucracy problems. And what I would like to point out especially is a guideline for interpretation of regulations. So especially in Germany with our system, we have every authority is interpreting the regulations a bit differently, and that makes it a hell for the project developer, and so we need central guidelines on the federal level, or it's better on a European level, how the regulation has to be interpreted. So that's for this point here.
You mean environmental legislation, or?
For example, yeah, yeah, for example, that of course the public interest point. It's very important in that as well, though, because the weighing of interests of different public interests. So it's very important that renewables are considered as public interest as well. So we need the weighing, but besides of the weighing or in the process of the weighing, we need guidelines for the people that have to do that in the authorities, and not everybody in every authority is doing that every day. And especially those people need more guidelines. We as a project developer do that every day, but not every single authority. And we need more guidelines for them, that they don't invent the wheel every day new.
I think it's now time to turn to you, Vera, a bit on that, and especially on this, because on this bureaucratic aspect, because we really see that a lot of the issues are really linked with long processes, deadlines not met, of course also a complexity of processes for the different type of authorities that are involved. There was this idea of budget, of guidance. What do you think of that, and what are the plans of the Commission?
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, I think Jorga's presentation and Dominic's presentation showed very well that process-related barriers are really dominating across Europe, in some countries more than others, but it's really a big issue. And we hear this all the time from project promoters like yourselves, and it affects the different renewables technologies, PV and others. And the European legislation already has some provisions in the Renewable Energy Directive on the maximum length of the procedures, on providing manuals of procedures, proposing the option of a one-stop shop to promoters. But we see that the implementation and the transposition of these measures is quite challenging for member states, and there's a lot of room for improvement, for learning from each other. Dominic showed that there are good practices in some member states, and therefore our aim is to provide the guidance to member states to learn from each other on these good practices. And yeah, this guidance will be published before summer, and we are now in the process of gathering inputs from stakeholders in seminars like this one, and also through an open public consultation. I invite you all to reply to it on the Have Your Say portal. You can find it, it's called Renewable Energy Projects, Permit Granting Processes and Power Purchase Agreements. And yes, I hope we can make this a useful exercise for everyone to accelerate the renewables deployment, because this is really needed to achieve the ambition of the European Green Deal. And Naomi's figures at the very beginning showed that there's a great potential to scale up, especially PV deployment.
Thank you. So indeed, yeah, a guidance and the idea to share those best practices, but not necessarily a budget for member states, if I understand correctly.
There are options. We have seen some member states using EU funding to staff in permitting authorities. So this will be one of the good practices that we will put forward.
Okay. Okay. Maybe then turning to another topic that came up in our discussions is the question of really accessing land. We have heard some best practices from Dominic and Jorga, and I would like to know a bit from your perspective what should be done. There was also really this idea that information on land should be available to developers, that there should be some planning also to identify lands for agri-PV. In Germany, there was this idea to reserve some share of the land for wind. So from your perspective, what is missing at the moment? Is it already done? Should it be done more? And what's the best approach to this land issue? I don't know who wants to start first.
I can start. So I think in Germany the initiative to reserve 2% of the land for wind is for wind very important. So because in wind we always have with the spatial planning the issues, and therefore that's the right measure. in solar parks, for example, the situation is completely different. So the planning authorities are the local municipalities, and that's in solar parks we mainly for wind for land access, and that's true all over Europe. We have the land use conflict. So we don't have the land use conflict in wind onshore because they only need a small area. So we have more the acceptance. In solar parks, it's a land use conflict, and we have to resolve this land use conflict with the agriculture. And ways to do that are floating PV or agri PV, but that won't be the solution completely. We can not only build agri PV, we need much more PV. We need conventional solar parks as well. But those conventional solar parks can be supporting biodiversity, and they can be environmentally adapted. And that is in our responsibility as a project developers, that we commit to those standards and that we find ways with the agriculture to bring biodiversity hotspots into the intensive agriculture and so on. And so it's partially a question of the legal conditions, and partially it's our own responsibility to promote those more environmentally adapted projects.
And maybe because you talk about conflict of uses, and it really shows that this is an area where there are different stakeholders involved, right? There is you talked about the agricultural community, you talked about the environmental community, and also picking up on a question that arrived in the chat, what key stakeholders involved can do to support the development, or how could we involve these stakeholders, especially, for example, at EU level, to improve the development of agri PV and of conventional PV. Is there a role for the government, for example, to facilitate a cooperation with these stakeholders? I don't know if Daniel or Andrea, you have views on that.
Well, I can take it. There are many measures that are already in place in some countries. For instance, in France, if there is the participation of the local community into the project, you can get some more money out of the tariff. But there are many other measures that can be implemented. We in Energy Power, we are working also on crowdfunding on some projects. So the participation of local citizens to a minority share of the project. Then we do many plans of what we call CSV, which is creating shared value with local communities. In Europe, of course, it is a type of action that we do with dedicated projects, but you can imagine in Africa, in other countries where there are the local communities have other needs. It's something that we do to involve the local community and to increase the local acceptance. So something that we are doing, and of course these actions are increasing. Nevertheless, the administrative procedures and the laws open the side of projects to claims. More or less 70% of projects in Germany and France are appealed today. And this creates 2-3 years of extra time after the building permit. This is another pain point in the permitting and in starting the construction of a project that is ready for construction.
Sorry, and that you, Andrea, you mentioned that you're following an approach for clearing shared value, if I understood correctly.
Creating, no, not clearing, creating a shared value.
Okay. Thanks. Then I think I got an idea. Okay.
But for example, Naomi, just one question. There is an example, for example, or it was a recommendation, a suggestion, for example, from I think it was Cyprus, that there should be like a spatial plan for installations with some green, orange, and red zones, which is also being done for wind power in some countries. Do you think it would help that such plans, spatial plans, would foresee already some places for installations, and this should, in ideal case, of course, reduce legal challenges at the end? Do you think it's a promising solution, or are you skeptical about it?
Actually, if I may react on that, I think it would be a good solution, but the really key point on spatial planning is to find the right level at which point we should decide that. Mm-hmm. And I think in France, there are not many good examples, good practices from France. I saw that in the presentation. But if we have the right scale, which is really intercommunalities, because we at city level is too little, and at department level is too big. So we have an intermediate level that works well, but the problem we face is that so cities are talking for like 3 or 4 years to make up those plans, and then they have to be integrated in local urban plans. So it's 4 more years. So at that space, we cannot reach our objectives, because it makes like at least 6 to 8 years to have this strategic planning enforced. So we need to find a way to streamline that and to accelerate those negotiations.
This is in the short term, but if you look at the medium and longer term, if these plans are already in place, so I understand these 4 years plus 4 years, it's difficult, but if these plans are already in place, I hear myself, sorry.
Sorry, there's an echo, I cannot hear you well.
I mean, this is what you said. This is bad if you look from the short-term perspective, but if you look from the medium-term perspective and long-term perspective, after these 4 or 8 years, in the worst case, when the plan is already in place, would it be helpful or not?
I think it is, because it would in a way resolve the land conflict. But again, it depends on how it's done and the level of acceptance and the share of lands dedicated to renewables. So, I mean, there's a lot of happens with it.
And I think there's also, but again, I would like your reaction on that, a question of regularity of the exercise. No, we have a lot of projects happening every year, so we need to have something probably a bit dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. So the spatial planning and as Jorga described, I think it is different, and we have to find the right level of the authorities that are doing that. For example, wind onshore has to be planned, the spatial planning has to be done on a much higher level of authority, so in Germany on a country level or something, or regional level, and the solar parks on a level of the municipality, because the situations are much more different for that, and you need really to find the right places in the area of the municipality, and in wind onshore it's a higher level, much higher level, and so it's different. There won't be one solution that fits all. We have to have regard on that.
Yeah, no, it's point taken. I would like to now touch quickly on the topic of grid connection, because this also came up as a big barrier. And then Vera, I would like to maybe have your reaction on all of this, because but anyway, starting with grid connection. So we heard that the grid connection processes are long because the processes are long, because the authorities are not necessarily staffed, but it's also a question of grid capacity. Can you expand a bit more on that? Do you think we could have innovative solutions like battery storage or limited or cable pooling solutions that could be implemented? And are these solutions implemented, and can they actually help solving the question of grid connection processes? Daniel, I think you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, grid connection is a big issue, and I think we need. It's not only the time that it takes and the grid capacity itself. It's a transparency. So in most of the countries, we don't have any transparency on the grid. And I don't understand that why that situation, how it is. Grid is a monopoly, and the public has a right to get all the data. And for example, Chile is a very good example for that. They are publishing everything. You can in the internet, you can find everything. You can make your planning. You can prove what the grid operator is saying, and that is important. And that should be a European regulation. I don't understand why we couldn't do that on a European level. So that would help us very much. And of course, the priority regulation and the obligation of a grid operator to connect the plant. As we have it in Germany, for example, that helps much. So that is, and if we have those two solutions, then we can come to the plant. That the plant should be more grid supportive, with batteries and with all those things. That is a second step. But in the first step, we need the transparency in the grid and the obligation of the grid operators to connect the plants.
So I think that was clear. I don't know if Andrea, you have something to add.
I fully agree. There is not visibility on what's going on in the grid. So this the situation, the picture of today on a certain grid in a certain country. What are the application for new connections, and what are the plans of reinforcement into the grid? So this is a lack of visibility I see almost everywhere in Europe, in all the countries where we're working. Then there is as I was saying before, there is a lack of regulation on some technologies that today are needed, in particular for solar PV. So batteries, battery energy storage systems is, let's say, a normal practice today, but in most of the countries, those technologies are not recognized by the grid. There is no regulation on how to implement them. Then, furthermore, in my personal opinion on grid connections is that they are not optimized today for renewables. The standard practice and the standard regulation in many countries is to have the plant installed capacity the same size of the connection capacity. Something that, for instance, in hydropower doesn't exist since decades, I would say. So the installed capacity of a hydropower plant is always higher than the connection, because it's natural that a renewable plant can produce at the maximum capacity for 5-10 days per year. No, so in that way, it could be possible to produce much more with the same grid assets. Also thinking about the existing grid assets. So when we go and do a repowering on a certain specific project, we could think on increasing the installed capacity by keeping the same connection capacity, for instance, or adding another technology in order to complement the production. So adding solar PV to wind or wind to solar PV. I think this would be the new, let's say, egg of Columbus that could boost, could increase the installed capacity and production of renewables by keeping the existing assets of grid.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been working on that at Solar Power Europe, and a lot of ideas that we find a lot of ideas that you mentioned in this report. Vera, I would like to turn to you for closing and wrapping up words on the ideas that were discussed, and then we will have MEP Paulus closing this webinar.
I think I would simply like to thank all the panelists and participants. Those are all very valuable inputs for us for drafting our guidance for member states. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vera, for the inputs and for all of the questions in the chat. We'll take them and share them with the panelists to follow up, of course. now I would be very delighted to welcome Jutta Paulus to share some closing thoughts to this webinar. So I hope we can see you in a moment. So of course, Jutta Paulus, you are a member of the Parliament, yeah, for the Greens. I give you the floor. Ha. Well, technical issues, we're trying to see if we can solve them through the phone or not. Yeah. Yeah, there should be a button somewhere with a microphone.
Now it.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I was muted by the moderator and I could not unmute myself, which is why it took a bit. Sorry. Yes, I think it's high time for this webinar, and so I'm very grateful that you actually shone a light on the obstacles that are hampering solar deployment all over Europe. And I think it is very interesting. It was very interesting to hear the different issues, the different amount of bureaucracy and administrative issues, and these are very, very heterogenic all over Europe, which also is an explanation for the heterogeneity in deployment of solar power all over Europe. So I think it's high time that bureaucracy issues must be resolved, because these are the main obstacles that prevent the countries to meet the 2-year deadline for permitting. In my opinion, 2 years is even far too long. It should be possible in a much shorter time. We have heard in the panel discussion that, for example, when it comes to wind permitting, there are many more issues to be recognized and to be worked on, such as noise, such as effect on biodiversity, on birds, on bats. And this is all not the case with solar parks, because they are fairly silent, I must say. So I think that even this 2-year permitting period should be shortened, and that it is high time that all member states do their homework and look at what they have to change in their national legislation and how they can speed up the process. And I think it would also be a good idea if the European Commission, maybe as part of their solar strategy, which will be launched pretty soon, there is this public consultation running right now, if they would look at how can they as Commission support the member states, give them access to good practice, and develop guidelines for the permitting process. The access to land has also been made an issue in the panel discussion, and I think that's something that's maybe not on the same, doesn't have the same impact in every and each single member state. We have member states which are not as densely populated. We have member states with areas which are not so much contented, let's put it that way, because, for example, agriculture is only possible if you have sufficient irrigation, sufficient rain, sufficient water resources, whereas a solar park would function by 100% even if there is no rain. So basically there is more land available in some member states as compared to others. But I think we really have to look at the individual situation in the member states, and I would really hope that those innovative concepts like floating PV or agri-PV are gaining up speed. And there also I do have the hope that the Commission in its their solar strategy will also address these issues. I think it is a pity that this wasn't recognized in the Common Agricultural Policy, that a co-use of land with agri-PV could grant an additional income for farmers by at the same time harvesting not only food but also energy from the same space of land. And I think we we as a parliament have the obligation to make sure in the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive that there is an obligation for strategic planning and also for strategic spatial planning, which should be done by each and every member state in order to be able to reach their renewable goals. Because just addressing it in the climate and energy plan, saying, well, we have these and those targets, but we don't really know how to reach them, that won't do the trick. So we should put this obligation in the Renewable Energy Directive, and I really hope that we as Greens will be able to put forward this this approach also, and find also sufficient support in the other political groups. I think the Single Market Enforcement Task Force it's a good idea that they are seized with a topic that they should find ways to remove the barriers to permitting. And of course, we also need monitoring on how this is proceeding, because just saying, well, go ahead, remove your barriers is fine, but we have to have the proof that this is actually happening, because else we will not be able to reach our climate targets. We are aiming for a much higher share of renewable energy in 2030 as compared to today, and this has to be deployed within a very limited period of time. So I think it is about permitting barriers, it is about involvement of citizens. Thank you very much for mentioning this in the panel discussion. I firmly believe that by accelerating access of citizen energy communities, renewable energy communities, also to solar facilities, to building solar facilities, to being able to participate in the electricity market in a non-discriminatory manner, that could really give a push to solar deployment all over Europe. And last but not least, we have the EPBD upcoming, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And I think it would be a very good idea to root in this EPBD not only the renovation rates, the efficiency targets, but also a firm target for the production of renewable energy on site for buildings where this is possible. Of course, there might be situations where a building is at the north side of something, always in the shadow, blah, blah, blah. But if any building gets touched, if anyone puts a scaffold around a building and there is no solar power on the roof, there should not be any barrier of doing so. And if it's a building which is inhabited by tenants, not by the owners themselves, of course the tenants should get access to cheap solar energy from their own roof. This is already more or less enshrined in the Clean Energy Package, and now it's time to make this fly. Also within the new European Bauhaus initiative, we have this firm obligation. We should root this firm obligation to build sustainably, to produce renewables as far as possible within the building's hull. And there we have a huge potential all over Europe. I don't know how many millions of buildings could be retrofitted with solar panels on the roof or on the facade. And last but not least, we of course would also need the production of modules and cells in Europe, because it wouldn't make any sense to exchange dependency on fossil fuel imports with dependency on solar panel imports. And therefore, I think it's high time that the Commission develops an important project of common European interest, meaning a gigawatt-size solar model production in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these inspiring words and for accepting to close the webinar. I think we can just all be inspired by the challenge that we have ahead of us, and yeah, work on this very multi-level problem that is permitting, and that is the energy transition. But multi-level problem, I should say multi-level opportunity. Thanks to everyone for attending, and thanks to our distinguished speakers and presenters. We will share with you the presentation, the recording, as well as the link to the public consultation of the Commission on this topic of permitting. Thanks again, everyone, and have a very nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.